I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good evening. My name is Esther Peters, and I am the Associate Director for the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. And I'm excited to welcome everyone to tonight's Series of Voices with Russell Scott Valentino. Series of Voices is an author-centered series of readings and conversations on books from or about Central and Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Our long-term partner for this series is the Seminary Co-op Bookstores, the first not-for-profit bookstores whose mission is bookselling. The bookstores are once again open for book buying. If you are in the Chicago area, you can always stop in to both the Seminary Co-op and 57th Street Books, and they continue to fulfill orders and support book sales for virtual events like this one through their website, semcoop.com. You can find more information about future events in this series and other events either that CEERES is doing or that are happening at the Seminary Co-op at both of our websites, which are in the chat box. If you're interested in catching up on past events for CEERES and in particular Series of Voices, I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel where you can find past events, certainly from the past year, and we will shortly be uploading some of our events that have happened over the last few weeks. Tonight, we are excited to welcome, as I already mentioned, Russell Scott Valentino to talk about his recent translation of Miljenko Jergović's novel Kin. And I'm going to let our interlocutors for this evening provide a fuller introduction for both the work of Jergović and a much fuller introduction for Professor Valentino. But for the moment, let me introduce our interlocutors. Angelina Ilieva is an instructional professor of Balkan and South Slavic literature for the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on the role of trauma and sublimity and in the emotional power of national identity. And she will be joined by Nada Petković, an instructional professor of the languages of the former Yugoslavia, also in the Slavic department at the University of Chicago. And her work focuses on the languages and literature of the former Yugoslavia, cultural anthropology of the region, and urban studies, with a particular interest in the recent state and city branding. Two last notes before I turn things over to all of our speakers. We will be giving away up to 10 copies of Kin this evening. If you are interested in a copy, please let us know by putting your name and email address in the chat box. And there will be time for questions at the end of the event. If you have a question at any time in the evening, please use the Q&A box, which is already open. You can enter your own question. If you see a question you're particularly interested in that you would definitely like to hear an answer for, please hit the thumbs up sign, and that'll let us know that we should make sure to try and get to that question first up. And with that, I am going to turn things over to the reason you are all here, and I will turn things over to Angelina and Nada and Russell. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Esther, and thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for making it tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce Russell Scott Valentino tonight. He's a scholar, an editor, and a translator. He's authored 2 scholarly monographs and co-edited literary and non-literary collections, 3 of them. And he's also the founder and senior editor of Autumn Hill Books. And he's translated into English 8 books of fiction and literary nonfiction, and from Italian, Russian, and Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. He's the recipient of 2 Fulbright research grants and 3 National Endowment for the Arts translation grants. He's also the editor. He served in the past as editor-in-chief at the Iowa Review from 2009 to 2013, and as president of the American Literary Translators Association from 2013 to 2016. And when he's not busy doing that, he is also teaching. He's a professor and chair in the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at Indiana University, Bloomington. and also in comparative literature. And the reason we're here today is because his translation of Bosnian author Miljenko Jergović, a historical saga named Kin, or translated as Kin, was published by Archipelago Books in June of 2021. And I will now turn it over to Nada Petković, who is going to introduce briefly Miljenko Jergović, the author, and start us off with questions for our guest tonight. Thank you.
Nada, you're muted. You need to, can you unmute?
You told me to mute myself. I'm so sorry. I didn't say anything important. I only said good evening. We are here today actually to celebrate both the author and the translator. So I will just give a few words about Miljenko Jergović, although I assume that most of you are familiar with this name and his work. Actually, if you want to know more about Miljenko Jergović, please read the book. You'll find out more than you need to know. So Jergović is one of today's most prominent writers hailing from Bosnia and Croatia. Born in 1966 into an ethnic minority family in Sarajevo, then part of the Yugoslav Federation, he enjoyed a peaceful and idyllic childhood. Even as a young man, Jergović knew his true calling was in the world of writing. While still in high school, he worked as a journalist, then studied literature at the University of Sarajevo, where he received his BA MA in 1987, being only 21 years old. Soon after graduation, he published his first collection of poetry entitled Warsaw Observatory, which heralded his debut in the literary world. The book won 2 prizes, one of which was for young poets. He continued a dual-track career writing informative and well-researched pieces for media outlets, as well as short stories and full-length novels. After a series of wars disrupted and the geopolitical balance in his homeland, he left Sarajevo and resettled in the capital of Croatia. He remained prolific, publishing numerous books, short stories and poetry collections, and collections of journalistic essays. His landmark story collection, Sarajevo Marlborough, from 1994, received the Erich Maria Remarque Peace Prize in 1999, and collection Mama Leone won the highly rated Premio Grinzane Cavour for, sorry, I butchered your Italian, Russell, for best foreign book in Italy. His novel Riviera, Buick Riviera, Inshallah, Madonna Inshallah, Gloria in Excelsis, Father, and King won his further acclaim. He now lives in and works in Zagreb. If you allow me, I would move immediately to the subtitle of my comments and questions that I will call scope. So just a few observations quoting the reviewers. Keeney's dazzling family epic, a portrait of an era, vast, generous, spirited story of family across the face of the 20th century, and so on and so on. A masterwork of modern European letters that should earn the authors a wide readership outside his homeland. or as it's beautifully, really beautifully summarized on the French flip of the cover, Keene is a family epic with a sprawling narrative which spans the entire 20th century by peers into the dusty corners of the family's past, illuminating them with a tender poetic precision. It is fair to say that in this book, Jergović pulls off an intricate and innovative narrative encompassing biography, history, travel log, and fiction. Dazzling or not, critics can argue Keene remains an epic. The most, unfortunately, the most obvious physical aspect of any literary work, noticeable at first glance, is its scope. No matter how specific or narrow, it often dictates the initial attitude of many potential readers. The scope can affect them in two ways. Either they respond to the challenge offered or dismiss it as too demanding. And the list of books that we haven't read is long, especially in today's era of fast communication and lack of free time. Just to remind you of Borislav Pekic's Golden Fleece, certainly one of the most voluminous domestic example. So I would like to ask you, Russell, I would like actually you to help challenge our readers, especially those not previously too curious about the region's history, by inspiring them to dive into this dazzling family epic.
Thank you. Inspiring them to dive in. So it's, as you look at the book, you might not be inspired to dive in unless you just are really attracted to long books. As the editor of the editor and founder of Archipelago, Jill Schoolman is. She's made a kind of a tradition of finding authors who write big, long books and then championing them in English. And so I think she's built a kind of a repository of authors that are like that. It was Archipelago that published Knausgaard's My Struggle. And in some ways, this is a similar sort of a book to that, also difficult to define. But sweeping, the kind of book that in some ways is like one of those big fat 19th century novels that you start and then you can't stop. It is, I think, easy to read, I hope. In my translation, it's also easy to read. I tried to imitate his Jergovic's stylistic tendencies there because he is an intimate narrator, and when it's as if you're listening to him telling you stories often in the book, and he's at the same time extremely sincere, but and dealing with very serious subject matter, but he's also he's got a very strange sense of humor sometimes too, and there are funny sections of the book that I wasn't sure when somebody wrote to me at one point and they said, I found him so hilarious in this other book. And when I read that, I thought, uh-oh, I haven't been laughing as I've been translating this thing. Maybe I'm missing something. But then I went back through it and reread as I was proofing, and I was laughing. And I think it was just because I was working so hard the first time through that first and second and third, that I wasn't laughing. I was just trying to get it right. But there are actually very darkly funny passages in the book, sometimes on the basis of a phrase that he keeps and then sort of dances circles around. One that comes to mind is a phrase that is in Croatian. It's spavati kao zaklan, which means something like to sleep like a log in English, but and I thought, okay, I can just translate it as sleep like a log, but in the section of the book, the character who hears it is somebody interprets it for him. He's not a local person, and he hears this phrase and he's really shocked. What do you mean sleep uh, like and it's somebody who has had his throat slit. It's a slaughtered man, and that's what it means literally. But you would say sleep like a log in English. That's all it means. But he hears it literally, and so he is inspired. He's an artist, and he's inspired to create a self-portrait of himself lying in his bed, sleeping like a log, but it's with his throat slit. And then Jergović goes on for a page and a half about this artist and this one work which was kept in a museum in Sarajevo, and it's hilarious, but it's also very dark. And then if you do a little more research, you discover that this guy didn't exist and it was all made up. And this guy's biography as well was invented, and all of these works which are held in various parts of Europe are also invented, and the joke is in a sense on us. It's one of the techniques that Jergović likes to use in the book, and it reminds me in some places of Nabokov creating a biography of somebody, and you think it's real until you go and figure it out, and that person never did that, or that person didn't exist. I hope that's a beginning to introduce the pleasures of reading the book.
Wonderful. I really enjoy, and you're right. It's very easy to read. It's an easy read. But let's now all of us discuss something actually more important for this book. And I keep calling it a book. Let's talk about the genre of this book. I came across some very interesting review in one of the Croatian journals, and it says the end of it was entitled "The End of Family Time: A Novel or a Monument." So the reviewer questions Keen's genre, and he says somehow that actually genre does not exist in this book. He said you cannot classify into any, not even into 2 or 3 clear or unambiguous systems. Indeed, trying to determine the book's genre is really not a simple task, because it encapsulates, if we would like to put in one sentence, maybe something like a novel that demands polyvalent reading. In the novel contains nearly everything that writer can offer, combining many constituent parts: episodes of a novel, short stories, authentic documents, epistolary records, essays, digressions, fragments, and photographs at the very end. And all of this in the key of so-called reality prose. Now, Jergović also said once in an interview that names should not be changed. They should be left as they are, and then the author should manage the destinies of literary heroes, lead them through the narrow path between the life that was lived and the one that is narrated. And he continues, but in such a way as to be more credible than reality, so that through narration one can see the writer's biography. Everything is true and nothing has to be true. And I think this is the key moment in his book. Everything is true and nothing is, and we talked about it briefly previously yesterday, actually, we prepared. I'll let you tell me more about this. And you said at some point when you talked to him, you found out that some things that you believe were actually happened, they did not happen.
Actually, I didn't ask him those questions. I discovered them on my own, just during my research in trying to get aspects of the book right. I thought, oh, I'll go to the source and find something that he was writing about, and then I discovered he had made it up. He does it in a very skillful way, and so sometimes they're merged together with something that with a real character. Sometimes a member of his family is not a member of his family. He's made up the member of his family too. But in the question of genre, it's a great question because it's not, and it's not just an academics question. You know, sometimes people say, well, it's just a genre. It's just about how you classify things, but that's not really true. The genre is the way that we prepare ourselves to read something. You think it's a satire, you read it like a satire. If you think it's a tragedy, you read it like a tragedy. And so deciding what it is before you get to it is kind of a natural thing to want to do. We can see that it's big, and people use that word epic. So that's almost a genre marker. When you say epic, you get sweep, you get largeness, you get that epic style music. You got public facing people, maybe a certain degree of heroism. I don't think that's quite a good description. At least it doesn't capture everything. It's a very general one. It's a little like saying, why are all those, answering the question, why are all those people in the train station? Well, they're there for a whole bunch of different reasons, and the most general thing you say about it is going to be the least satisfactory in a way. So he is very conscious of the genre, of the genres of the book. And you're right, it doesn't have a genre name. It's just called Rod. And in English, it's just called Kin. It's not called Kin, a novel, or Kin, a family saga, or anything like that. It's just Kin. And then when you when you open the table of contents and you start reading, you recognize that actually every section of the book has a genre name associated with it. So the first one is called Where Other People Live, a presentation. And the second one is called The Stublers, a family novel. And the third one is called Miners, Smiths, Drunks, and Their Wives, quartets. And the quartets are little four-part vignette stories. And the fifth one is called Mama UNESCO, a report. So he's giving you a signal in each of these that it's something different and a different genre. Then the next one is, I love this title, and I didn't quite know how to deal with it, but Inventarna knjiga, which means an inventory book. That is a genre. It's a certain kind of a book, but I just called it inventories in my translation because I wanted to keep the question of invention in there as well. And then he's got a calendar of everyday events, fictions. Those are fictions, which suggests maybe the others are not fictions. And then he's got that section that you mentioned, history, photographs, and history is then yet another genre. And so it's very consciously done. It's very carefully labeled in each section. And when you read then the sections, even in them, you get a sense, okay, I'm reading something that's very different here. And my interpretive apparatus, my interpretive mindset probably needs to change as I read this thing and make sense of it. I think it feels the most different when you get to fictions, especially that very first one, which is a fanciful story about the appearance of General Kolchak in their chicken coop, and so there it's very clear. Okay, he shifted gears, and this is a different kind of a story altogether. But then he goes back, and even in that final section, there's a lot of stuff that you recognize from the earlier portions that seem to be autobiographical and seem to be historically based. And so he's melding and merging things together. It's a fascinating play with genre, and one of the attractive aspects of the book, it seems to me.
And this is why I was attracted to this a novel as a monument. And I think if the monument or monumental were a literary genre, I think Keane would definitely qualify.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is something broad about it. You wanted to say something, Angelina?
I just wanted to jump in and respond to what you were saying, that in many ways there is an intersection of family history or individual history and history writ large. But they also, as you were saying, they sound like, and he keeps going back to that they are almost like they're these stories, family stories that are told around the kitchen table. and they're
Yeah.
presented to us as this is what I heard and this is what my grandfather would tell us. And so there's an interesting intimacy to them, even as they talk about these grand events and how they affected the family history and the people involved in that. So it's a very peculiar moment. Or sometimes it's as if you're going through a picture album, a family album, and every page has a story associated with the picture as well.
Yeah, and I remember hearing him give an interview at one point about this book. It must have been right around the time it was published, 2013, 2014, something like that. And he suggested that you could start anywhere in this kind of a story. You could start anywhere, and in a way, you can. The stories circle around often, and it was one of the things I struggled with as I was translating. I kept thinking, okay, I heard this already. Did he need an editor? Did he need someone to help him cut back? And I don't think he did. I think what happened was he was doing a couple of different things. One is he was telling stories as people tell stories in a family. So he's kind of performing storytelling, which means they tell the story and then they elaborate on it, and it gets told again with slight variations, and he does that then in his story. And then as you read the book very carefully, and of course I did more than once, I recognized that it doesn't work to read it out of order, that there is a climax in the book. There is a direction that it's moving all the way through. And if you were to read, the last section first or whatever, you would not see that. You would not hit it the same way. Your monument question was, I think, a lead. You were about to lead in, if I remember, Nada. You had another one. I know it was a difficult question because you mentioned it to me beforehand, and I wasn't sure how to answer.
I'm debating which one to ask you first. Maybe let's move on language and translation right now, and then I'll mention this ideal Yugoslav. Those are the two questions I prepared you for. So let's talk about language and translation. Honestly, I don't need to quote Benjamin what the task of a translator is. You all know it, but a week ago I was planning to ask you why, for example, you haven't translated the term puferashi. Clearly, we both understand what's behind this idiom, or let's say a phrase that's not even a word in BCS. But then I read your blog in which you rationalized why you preserved this term and as many other colloquial terms in the original. And also I would like you to talk a little bit about the Turkicisms, because they obviously are still present in the language, and you gave quite a list of Turkish borrowings that you kept in their original form. And I think it gives a certain flavor. I think you use another word, actually, you said something, gives a little bit of exotic touch to the novel. And as we mentioned earlier, more and more you see this in literature when we preserve the original words, that it's not impossible, nothing is impossible to translate, but you definitely lose a lot by translating. So rather than recapping your reasoning, please tell the audience and future readers what sort of principles or justifications you apply when coming across such words, expressions, idioms, phrases, and so on.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one basic principle has to do with how frequently a word might appear. So if it goes by fast, it was just one word, and it's just an off an off mention, I might not keep it. I might choose to translate that. With Kufirash, it was an easy decision, it seems to me. And I for those of you who don't know what that means, it's the term that the locals used to refer to the people who came with the Habsburgs, right? So the people who worked on the railroads and in the banks and the functionaries of various kinds, from the word Koffer, which is their suitcase, right? So it was a German word, and they started applying that then to those people. Kufirash, a person with a suitcase, a little like a carpetbagger, I suppose. And if I were to translate it, it would have been something like carpetbagger, which has very, very different connotations in English. So I was thinking, well, there isn't a good word, first of all, to use to translate that. I couldn't find a good word. But then a second reason, and this is the main one, he puts a lot of emphasis on this word, and he uses it many, many times. And it's a way that he was designating his relatives, his ancestors who came to that part of the world with the Habsburgs. And also he talks about the derivation, he talks about where it came from. After 3 or 4 times of it appearing, even if he didn't do that, you would already have a sense of what it is, right? You would already have it would start to grow on you. It's one of those cases where the text teaches you how to read it. It teaches you how to read the text, right? You are learning how to read the text by means of the words that he's using in the text. That one, that's why I say it's an easy one. In fact, I would ask why you would not want to keep that word there, because it's so important and it's not obtrusive after 2 or 3 times. It doesn't even need to be italicized, in my opinion. It's just a word now, and we're gonna take it. There are words that go by really quickly that I don't think I kept. I'm pretty sure I didn't keep birvaktelski, which is a sort of old worldness from Turkish. I mentioned it to a Turkish friend, and she said, "Oh, that's a very old word. I kind of know what that means." Whereas I think it happens once in the whole text, maybe twice. And so I don't think I kept it in the English version. That is probably a recipe for needing to explain something, right? So if it's an unclear word, it comes up once. I remember reading a Chukchi novel that Archipelago also published by called A Dream in Polar Fog, and they have some notes at the beginning, so footnotes. They're in halftone text, so they're trying to make them unobtrusive. But I didn't want to have to resort to that. I felt like it might get in the way of people reading. So if I had to explain something, a term, I generally did it through something like a stealth footnote, which means I explained it in the line just before it. And that often happens with a name. It's known to the locals what that is. And so you just have to give the full name, let's say, or if it was a person, you might say the general blank, or you might say the Ustasha leader with the guy's name, in order to make it clear to people who don't come from there what that is, what the reference is. I think more often I did that in the text than keeping the original words. I doubt that I used the word exotic. I would hope that I was trying to achieve a kind of atmosphere and distinctiveness. I don't like to think in terms of exoticizing a text by means of these individual lexical items.
Blog, you did.
In the blog. Okay, well, that was my short-sightedness, because I feel it always feels a little bit cheap, right? To just be throwing in a foreign word here and there.
But your defense, we who read a lot of history of the Balkans, in ordinary history book, you often find these terms in Turkish because often they're hard to translate, like, Raya or Yanitsars, so it is not unusual. Okay, now if you would allow me, I will read this sentence that you selected, and then, because it's also part of your translation. So this is a sentence from the book in original, and then you will tell us how you overcame this missing September. So the sentence in Croatian would sound like, bilo je to krajem septembra, bilo je to krajem septembra, rujna, kako se nekad govorilo u jezuita, I trajalo je ono najljepše miholjsko ljeto kada se Bog prikaže I onima koji ne veruju.
Mhm. So it's a little complicated. It's not a terribly complicated one, but it's complicated by the fact that there are two words for September being used, September and Rujan. The September is probably more Serbian and more international and Yugoslav, whereas Rujan is both Croatian and also religious. It has a religious connotation, which is why he gives it to the Jesuits in this, that he says, as the Jesuits used to call it.
It's actually Old Slavic more than anything else.
And so, yeah, so he's using these two words, and we only have one in English. So I was, casting about, looking for other kinds of words that we might throw in there for the second kind of September. It's also it's a moment in the book where, as I said, there is a climax, and this is close to the climax. And he's doing one of those scene-setting things where he slows down the pace, and he gives you this moment in the text where there's some reflection, and it feels like the pace is slowing down. And so I wanted to achieve that along with this differentiation of the two kinds of September. And so what I came up with was the religious aspect. I looked for something like Michaelmas, but I realized that a lot of people wouldn't know what that is unless they read Old English literature. It's in like Sir Gawain in the Green Knight. Michaelmas, I think, is when they start that story. So this is what I came up with. It was the end of September, and the long, beautiful Michaelmas summer stretched on as God showed himself even to those who did not believe. And that turn at the end, I have to say, that is a Jergović thing to do. He leaves it's almost like a kicker at the end of the sentence that makes you reevaluate the whole thing. Good short story writers do this. You get to the end of the sentence and you think, oh, that's what he was talking about at the beginning. And so that's in microcosm, this sentence does a lot of the kind of things that Jergović does elsewhere.
Angelina, would you like to?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to say while you were speaking, Russell, was I thought it was really working well. These little footnotes that you give that are embedded in your text.
Yeah, the hidden ones. Yeah, yes. Stealth footnotes.
But what I wanted to ask in relation to the Turkisms that you were talking earlier was about he talks about Croatian certain texts. He talks about certain texts being too Croatian and not enough Bosnian, and I'm wondering if you felt that in the text and how you handled it.
So I think I remember the passage where that you're talking about. It's a criticism of himself. So he imagines himself having died, and then people making comments about him. And one of the comments that this guy makes is that he remembered that guy, that author, that writer, and he had read something by him, an article, but it seemed way too Croatian. And he doesn't say what it was. he doesn't spell it out. And so that could be a linguistic thing, or it could be a cultural thing. And he does that often in the book. Actually, he throws in these criticisms of himself that other people have made of him. Sometimes they're linguistic. More often they're not. More often it's not about language. They're about attitudes and opinions. So he has come out in favor of something, or he's championed a cause of some kind, and somebody didn't like that, or he criticized somebody and they didn't like it. So these internal politics are playing out in the book as well. Some of them are very nasty, but I don't think they're primarily linguistic. However, he does differentiate the speech of various characters and the usage of various characters, and So the characters who are, sort of local Bosnian Muslim characters in Sarajevo, you do get a sense that they're using more and more Turkishisms and more, and as do other Sarajevo characters from that particular generation. And he is careful, I would say, in his own writing to differentiate characters on the basis of individual lexical items often. So if he has characters, for instance, in Dubrovnik, they tend to speak slightly differently. If he has characters in Sarajevo, they have more Serbianisms, more Turkishisms. So they use komšija and other kinds of words that are known to be Sarajevan. And then if he has characters in Sarajevo, in Zagreb, they come across as not just linguistically, but also culturally as Croatian. And I think that's probably most palpable in the case of the character Maximilian Stinčić, I think his name is, who's a pianist based on actual people, but it's not. That's one I did ask him about. He said it's based on an actual person, but that's not his name. So yeah, but you can get a sense of his thorough Croatianness, and that comes across in the idioms that he uses as well.
So you didn't feel in the narrative voice any kind of shift, like for example in that story of Stinčić, the pianist, because it's entirely set in Croatia. There was no shift from when it's set in Sarajevo.
So the narrator, my sense of the narrator voice, as this guy, so it's Jergovic's stand-in, is pretty consistent. That he doesn't change his idiom when he's depicting the idioms of other people. His stays pretty consistent all the way through.
I will agree. May I throw something maybe related? I would like to criticize some of the critics, and I hope the two of you would agree with me. I came across two terms for Jergović: the ideal Yugoslav, and some critics even pointed out that Keen is ultimately Jergovic's ode to Yugoslavia. And I'm a native of Belgrade, and I still consider myself a Yugoslav, but in a positive sense. Now, there is no fake nostalgia here or anything of that sort. It's simply the country I was born and raised in. But I would disagree with this proposition because the universal reach of Jergovic's work simply cannot be even limited to the country, the multinational countries such as Yugoslavia. And I think that the novel speaks to a vast human audience of nations, communities, people, kinship network across the world. And I would like you to continue and help me understand why would this be labeled as an idea, as an ode to Yugoslavia?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know why somebody might say that, but I'm assuming that it was somebody who doesn't like Jergovic's work, or thinks of it as old-fashioned in some Yugoslav manner. The big 20th century historical novels by Yugoslav authors are in some sense odes to Yugoslavia, and to me, it seems like it's an oversimplification, but also it narrows the book down quite a bit to call it that. If it's an ode to Yugoslavia, which it could be among other things, it's also an ode to the Sarajevo of his youth. I mean, there's a lot about Sarajevo here, but there's also a lot about a kind of lost Sarajevo. It's changed over time. And I'd say it's an ode to his family, who went to Sarajevo and then kind of dispersed into the world. In some ways, it's an ode to his very strange relationship with his mother. He's even to the final pages of the book, he's still dealing with that. And in some ways, it's an ode to the Habsburg Empire too, because he has these passages where he talks about the kind of multicultural aspect of the Habsburg Empire, multilingual in particular, and the example he brings to bear is his grandfather, Franjo Rec, and who was a Slovene, but who also spoke. And then he lists all these languages. He spoke Italian because he was in an Italian a prison camp in World War I. He spoke Hungarian because he worked on the railroads. He spoke Romanian. He doesn't know why. He spoke German. He spoke Slovene. He spoke Croatian, and he was learning English at the end of his life because he thought that was the language of the future. And he holds him up as a kind of example, ideal example of Habsburg culture. And to that, he contrasts himself as a Yugoslav. And he thinks of himself as provincial and monolingual. And so in that way, it's not an ode to Yugoslavia at all. It's a kind of the opposite. He thinks that he got the short end of the stick here. The better example of multicultural belonging was his grandfather. And that culture has gone away. Anyway, that's the way I read it. And mixture is a big part of the book.
And that indeed was what Sarajevo was through centuries. So,
Yeah.
So this would, we wanted to read a few excerpts as well, and I'm looking that we're almost running out of time. In relation to this multiculturalism, I had also highlighted the intro that he has, the presentation with which he almost sets up his book.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to, if you're okay reading that, or
I can read a little bit. So yeah, the question you brought it up when we talked before about homeland, and I guess I thought of it more. I always think of this thing. I've learned to think of it as almost a treatise on mixture, and the kind of mixture that happens inside people, which is one of the reasons I think the book, you're right, Nada, is you can't narrow it down to one place because we're all kind of mixed in all sorts of different ways. But he manages to bring this out in this passage. My great-grandfather, as a Swabian German from the Banat, residing in Sarajevo, spoke a variety of Croatian filled with words derived from Turkish, which was characteristic of the people of the speech of Bosnian Muslims. He concealed his Serbian neighbors from the Ustaše, not primarily because he was a good and unselfish man, but because they were an important part of his own world. He probably didn't understand that what it would have meant to be a German in a place where there weren't any Serbs or Croats, Bosnians, Muslims, Jews. From his perspective and mine, in multi-ethnic countries, every form of hatred is just another form of hatred. This was why my Croatianness was so substantially different from that of the people I found myself surrounded by upon my arrival in Zagreb, and even from that of my friends and acquaintances. For while those people rejected hatred for intellectual and moral reasons, or simply as a fact of good breeding, I rejected it because it was a threat to who I was. Though I was a Croat, it threatened the Serb and the Bosniak inside me.
beautiful.
This is a constant theme of the book. One of them is this internalization of multiplicity.
yeah, and absolutely. Thank you for that. That's beautiful. And also, he follows that with the the orientation of multiplicity itself, that we see ourselves and reflected in others. So in that sense, I saw it as some kind of a nostalgia, perhaps, for that moment of Yugoslavia where that was possible, because he seems to not fit in present-day Sarajevo, and he seems to not fit in present-day Zagreb.
I think that's true. I think you're right. He identifies that he doesn't belong in Sarajevo anymore, and he doesn't belong in Zagreb either, and it's unclear where he belongs.
In the past.
In the past, maybe, yeah.
That, I mean, that was my
That's
sense of it.
that's the answer. Russell, you wanted to read another beautiful excerpt. about Lucio Fabiani. Do you?
Oh, fine. I can read that. Yeah, it's a pretty short one. Also, I have it here on the screen. I can read it. Do you want to read the Croatian or should I? Either way is fine. What's your preference? Tako je govorio.
Aha, tako je govorio Lucio Fabiani, zima svoga života. S umekšanim suglasnicima, onako po talijanski, pa bi zima bila cima, svoga zvoga, život zivot, i čim bi Čučo spomenuo zimu svoga života, oba bi mu oka bila puna suza. Ali ne onih koje niz obraze poteku, nego naročitih suza, stajačica, kakvih u to vrijeme u Sarajevu nije bilo, ni oko njega na pašnjacima među pčelinjacima, gdje su ih ljudi nazivali suze Talijanke. I čim bi netko u društvu spomenuo da su se kome oči napunile suzama, upitalo bi ga, je li Talijankama? I svi bi tad znali o kakvoj se žalosti, o kakvom čovjeku, o kakvim se suzama govori.
Yeah. So this is one of those places where he's making light of a situation. It is, I think, on some level a joke, but it's also got some pathos to it. This was what Lucio Fabiani said, the winter of one's life, with extra vowels and softened consonants, as in Italian, so that winter was a winter, one's was a once, life was a life. And the moment Chucho remarked on the winter of a once a life, both his eyes would be filled with tears, only not the kind that run down your face, but that particular kind of stay-in-place tears that did not exist in Sarajevo then, or anywhere nearby on the pastures or grazing lands among the beekeepers, so people called them Italian tears. And any time someone might remark in conversation about how another's eyes had filled with tears, they would ask, Italian ones? And then everyone would nod. And they would know about what kind of person, sorry, I cut off the end, and they would know what sort of person and what sort of tears they were talking about. So what's difficult here is the fact of the accent, right? He speaks with a particular kind of an accent, and in order to do that in the Croatian text, he focuses on the consonants, and he says that they're softened. So zima becomes zima, and svoga becomes zvoga, and život becomes zivot. And we don't have, that's not how you do an Italian accent in English, right? You can't just do it with consonants. So I added a tiny little phrase with extra vowels and softened consonants, and then added that so a ones becomes a once, and so on, in order to get to something like an Italian accent in English. It was a sort of a fun passage to translate, but also I was so sorry to find that I missed something in the proof, and when it came to me, it must have got changed in the copy editing process, and I just missed a tiny thing, which was instead of ones, it says once. So my little I was so proud of what I came up with. It didn't quite come across in all the detail, but it still works pretty well in what is printed.
No one. Yes, absolutely. I think Esther will probably at this point. Esther, do you want to open the floor?
Absolutely. I think we have already a question from the audience. If one of you wants to read that question for Russell.
Sure. Belonging in the past, this is Vera Dragicic. I'm sorry. Belonging in the past due to being a displaced person in the present seems to have been intensely expressed by Jergović based on the first passage Russell read. Becoming so intimately involved in this work by translating it, I wonder, do you think, Russell, did Jergović find some place for himself in the presence, or at least in the presence, or at least some catharsis through this book?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to know whether he found catharsis through writing the book. I do think that a major part of his motivation, one of the reviewers said this, is to save things from being forgotten, save things from oblivion. And that reviewer also, I'm trying to remember who it was, said he's not so much a novelist as a storyteller. And he tells stories in order to address these things. They're sometimes objects, there's sometimes individuals, people, episodes, somebody playing a piano in the middle of the war, and create a narrative around them so that those things are not forgotten. And I think that's a pretty consistent technique that he uses. He's stringing things together, sometimes unusual things, using a very strange sort of concept for pulling a story together, like a bee journal that he finds in a bag in the basement. And you think, what could he possibly do to this with this? And then 120 pages later, he finishes what he did with that bee journal. And the same thing with other instances. This is in the latter part of the book, where he spins these narratives around objects, unusual objects, unlikely objects, in order to pull them together into a sort of narrative whole, and then you remember all of them. And I think that's what he's doing with the stories throughout. So if he found something, it was most likely in this vein, as a writer, as a storyteller, rather than I don't know, some ultimate sense of belonging somewhere. That seems like a tall order for him. He strikes me as not that sort of a person. I don't know that he's looking for belonging.
Yeah, it's almost like keeping those people and objects alive.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how did this novel change you when you inhabited it for so long, or did it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it did. I think you know, when you're translating something, especially something long like this, you start to get used to the rhythms of the book and the rhythms of the way the author thinks, the way he presents things. And I think as a result, I became a little more patient. He's a very patient writer, put it that way. So he'll do something very slowly, and you're willing to go with him because it's attractive, and so you follow what he's doing. It's like following a mind in thought. And I think I have become a little bit more patient in my own writing, not just in translating. You have to be patient when you're translating. You can't do it any other way. But in my own writing, I believe I've become a little bit more patient, and I'm willing to take time to develop something a little bit more slowly on his model. It's a model that I feel like I can learn a lot from. And maybe all of us can in some ways. That's why it's one of the reasons the book is so long. But that patience is really fundamental, and giving yourself that leeway to be patient is very important. And if I took something out of the book besides the backache, I'd say that's probably the most lasting piece. The stories are still going around in my head. They're never going to go away. But in terms of writing, I think that's the one I would highlight.
How? Oh, Nada, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious. You said that you flew to Zagreb to meet with him. How did he surprise you? Was he what you expected?
That's a good question. He looked more jovial in his pictures. He doesn't come across as a jovial person. Maybe that's shouldn't have surprised me. But he's a pretty serious guy. Uh, I like to, in my interactions, I like to make a joke and have a little laugh together. He had trouble laughing, I would say.
No Sarajevo famous humor.
Maybe maybe it comes out in different ways. There are, as I said, funny passages in the book, and they're kind of painful funny, but they are humorous, and we got on just fine, and we had lunch together, and and he was very gracious. Actually, the way that we met was he was reading my blog. I didn't know he was reading my blog, but I was writing questions about things that I was dealing with, and then I got this email from an unfamiliar email address, and it was in Croatian, and he said if the author could ever be of help in your translation, he'd be most happy to help you. And of course I wrote back and said, well, of course, yeah, I have a long list of questions for you. And after that I would email him occasionally. He wasn't my primary source of information, but when I did have questions for him, I would email him. His answers, I have to say, were sometimes fantastic. They were almost like novels. So I mean, you could feel that he was a storyteller, and even tell me what a word meant. So I asked him, I wasn't sure about this word "sim," and it's in a part of the house, and I could tell they were seem something about the architecture. So I wrote to him, and he wrote back 2 paragraphs. It was something like, "Oh, seam, that's a great word. It's in the westerns when the guys are running away from the law and they go out the window onto the roof and they run along the side of the roof and they're trying to get away. That's what it is. It's that part of the roof where they're trying to get away." So he told me a story in order to tell me what the word meant. And I think that's just the way his mind works. He's a storyteller.
So maybe you can publish those as footnotes, glossaries to the book.
I'll tell you one more story that's associated with this book. It could be in the book. Alta Price, who's one of your friends in Chicago and friend of the seminary, I know, she sent me, she knows about the book. She sent me an email where she had found this online Austrian magazine about literature, and they were asking local people in Vienna for book recommendations. And they talked with this elderly art dealer who was a woman in, I don't know, her 70s or so, and she had 2 recommendations. I don't remember the first one, but the second one was kin in the Austrian translation. And she said, and this was written by my cousin in Zagreb, and I didn't even know I had a cousin in Zagreb, but I remembered because I was reading this and I realized he's writing about my parents and grandparents, and these are the stories they used to tell. That's the sort of story that could be in this book, but it's like, okay, just the book just keeps going. It's about this multiplicity of family and how it goes to other places. And there are portions of the book where I recognize her name now, Dussel. Yes, I know that name. I know who she is. Somebody asked me, is there a family tree somewhere I can find for this family? And I haven't made one. And I'm not sure. There must be some question marks at the end of some of these little branches of the tree, probably because Jergović invented something. But it was a fascinating story. And I immediately sent him the clip and said, you might know about this already, but if you didn't, just here your cousin is reading your book.
So that's what it was. It was just Jergovic's version of 23andMe.
Yeah, something like that.
We didn't have time to talk about his run-on sentences. You wanted to read one paragraph, which pretty much a paragraph is one sentence. How did you deal with this, Slavic style when there is no end to a thought?
So one key I've noticed is to recognize that something called, I learned it when I was in graduate school, tema, the Russians say tema и rema. I think they just say theme and rime in English. And it's basically recognizing that different languages do things in different orders. And Croatian, like Russian, tends to throw a lot of the description stuff up front in the sentence. So in a certain place, at a certain time, over a period of time, through this guy did something. And English likes to reverse that and say he did it, and then you throw in the description after that. And I love these sentences actually because it's a form of time travel. Sometimes, you say something like having done that, meaning he did it first, or after he had finished and there's a little moment of jumping back in time in that, or jumping forward in some cases. And honestly, those long sentences are not the most difficult things. He he has a kind of artistic litany style, and this is not his only. This is not distinctive for Jergović. I would say a lot of South Slavic authors do this. Ivo Andrić is famous for these long sentences that have a lot of things in them. And so recognizing two things, that the order is often different, and then also that commas and periods have different weight in different cultures. For the French, a period can be a very harsh thing. So they don't like periods. They use a lot of commas, and the commas tend to link things together in ways that if you did it in English, you would be accused of bad style. You'd say, well, that's a comma slide, that's a run-on sentence. And so you have to just very carefully edit so that it doesn't sound choppy, but also that it doesn't offend some of those readers who are likely to look at that and say, you just got a run-on sentence. That's just a whole bunch of commas with phrases in between them. And so, yeah, so those two principles help me to shape these long sentences. Often they occupy the better part of a paragraph with many items in them. And in some cases, I might have changed the order of something in order to reach the right moment of height in the sentence, the apex of the sentence, where it felt like, okay, this is the big part right here. And in English, that might be a little different from in the source text. I keep calling it Croatian, but it's whatever that language is. It's Bosnian or Croatian or Serbian or some combination of them. Yeah, so that's basically how I approach those long sentences with
You
many
did a
parts.
beautiful job. I do some translation. I allow myself to compliment you. You really did a beautiful job.
Well, I appreciate it. It did take a while, and I'm glad it's finished.